The reason why two-thirds of the legislature are Republicans, almost all the Republicans, voted to put these amendments on the statewide ballot, two reasons. The first reason is that they probably didn't have time to read the bills because it was a shortened session, very protracted, and particularly in reference to Constitutional Amendment 2, it's 115 pages. I'm sure that they didn't have time to read it. I'm sure that many of them really didn't know what they were voting for.
Yeah.
The second reason why I believe they did this and why they're continuing to push this is because, as we talked about it earlier, the political structure of our government in Louisiana is such that the governor has an enormous amount of power. And if legislators do not do his bidding and do what he wants, then there is severe reprisal to them. And so they're reluctant to go against him for that reason, and I don't believe they're fully informed about what they voted on. That's why we're dealing with this right now. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us once again on the State of Freedom.
The State of Freedom is a listener-supported podcast. We're committed to pursuing the truth about policymaking, decisions, and situations in Louisiana and at the national level that stand to impact our freedoms.
Please become a monthly supporter of the State of Freedom at freedomstate.us as we continue to expand the voice of liberty across Louisiana and beyond.
Well, good morning, everybody. We are calling an audible today. Our guest today was meant to be Pastor Tony Spell. Unfortunately, he had to take a rain check. He had some things come up urgently. So we are just going to roll with it. It's been a while since you've had just Chris and I here at the helm of the show, but you might as well get used to it because you're going to be seeing more of this. We're headed into a legislative session pretty soon, April 14th, I believe. Chris, is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, and so we'll be making sure that you know what's on the agenda for the legislature coming up. But right now, today, we're going to talk about the amendments that will be on the ballot on March 29th, and we will just walk through those. You've heard from us before on our position on Constitutional Amendment number 2. We're going to focus on that a little bit, but we'll also get into the other 3. Before we do that, if you have your Bible handy, join me as I read the scripture of the day. It's Joshua chapter 14, verses 7 through 14. And I have to grab my Bible over here.
Wait a minute. I thought you had it memorized.
Will be an inheritance to you and to your children forever, because you have followed the Lord my God fully. Now behold, the Lord has let me live just as he spoke these 45 years from the time the Lord spoke this word to Moses when Israel walked in the wilderness. And now, behold, I'm 85 years old today. I'm still as strong today as I was in the day Moses sent me. As my strength was then, so my strength is now, for war and for going out and coming in. Now then, give me this hill country about which the Lord spoke on that day. For you heard on that day that Anakim were there, the great fortified cities. Perhaps the Lord will be with me, and I will drive them out as the Lord has spoken. So Joshua blessed him and gave Hebron to Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, for an inheritance. Therefore, Hebron became the inheritance of Caleb, the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, until this day, because he followed the Lord God of Israel fully. And I believe we're in a time right now where we have left the control of Egypt and we have reached the end of the wilderness. And the Lord has used that time to refine us, to strengthen us, and to remove the slave mentality from us. But the journey doesn't end here at the end of the desert. This is just a new chapter. It may be a whole new book. This is the time for war. The enemy is not going down without a fight. This is the time to draw near to the Lord, to hear his heart, to hear his instruction, and it's time to advance into the places that he has promised us. You may get tired of me saying this, but I'm not going to stop saying it. Chris isn't going to stop saying it either. This is not a time to relax. This is a time to advance, to speak up, to fight, and to win. Momentum is on our side because we're on the Lord's side. This is a spiritual battle, as you all know, and it's playing out in every sphere of our society. So my encouragement to you today, my charge to you today is to ask the Lord where your battlefield is and to get there. Because when you look back at this moment in history, you will want to be able to say that you were in the fight.
Absolutely. And we are in the fight. You know, Danielle, it's always a recurring theme in my life, and I would suspect in the lives of other Christians. When we are on the verge of great victory, but the Lord is asking us to continue to move forward, boy, Satan is so active in those moments, trying to get in any possible way that he can to fill us with fear and anxiety and dread. And it's at those moments when we have to be steeped in prayer and making sure that we are surrounded by God's power and protection and existing under the shadow of his wings, because the devil does not want us to succeed. Let's make no mistake about that. The devil wants us to fail. He wants us to exist in fear and anxiety, and he wants to put all kind of negative thoughts into our head. So let's put the Lord first and seek him first. Then we will have the courage and the power to proceed to the finish line here. And that's where we are, and that's what we have to do.
Yep, it's time to take the hill country.
No question about it. And we are very, very close. And Danielle, as you said at the start, 4 very important constitutional amendments on the ballot for March 29th, one of which has received a lot of publicity, but that's Constitutional Amendment 2, but really they all have serious problems, and I look forward to going through them.
We've all had instances crop up where we could use the advice or skills of a trusted attorney. Whether you're looking at the implications of new laws for your business, signing a contract or a lease, looking to write a will or establish a trust, or even resolve a dispute with your credit card company, LegalShield has got you covered. For over 50 years, LegalShield has made it affordable and easy to access a dedicated lawyer. With the app, LegalShield is like having a lawyer in your back pocket. For covered emergencies, LegalShield is here for you 24/7, plans to fit any stage of life. The State of Freedom is proud to be teamed up with LegalShield as clients and affiliates. To learn more or to sign up, visit the Shop Our Partners page on freedomstate.us or check out the link in the show notes. Thank you for supporting the State of Freedom.
Well, Chris, would you just give us a little background on Constitutional Amendment 2, our problems with it, and what's happening surrounding that? Because I think today's a big day for Constitutional Amendment 2.
Yeah. Constitutional Amendment 2 has very serious problems. I'm sure the legislature was very well intentioned with it, Danielle, but it's got serious structural problems, it's got procedural problems, and it's got substantive problems. The core structural problem of Constitutional Amendment 2 is that the ballot language is based upon a 115-page bill passed in the 11th hour of a special session in 2024. And the ballot language does not accurately represent what the bill actually means for Louisiana citizens. And I'll give you a good example and a real concern for pastors and a growing concern for pastors across Louisiana. The ballot language says that the constitutional amendment is retaining the religious exemption, the constitutionally protected religious tax exemption, which means that religious organizations do not have to pay property taxes to the government in order to be able to operate. But that's really not what the amendment does. The amendment actually curtails and narrows the religious tax exemption, whereas before, if you were a church or a religious organization and you rented property to another person, or you had rental property that you rented out, or you had, then you still would not be subject to a tax. That was still considered a religious activity. But now the amendment says that religious organizations will only get the property tax exemption if they are operating exclusively and solely as a religious organization.
Chris, let me just stop you right there. Is it just religious? This extends beyond an impact to religious organizations, right? This is also impacting nonprofits writ large across the state.
The amendment severely narrows the religious property tax exemption, and it completely guts the constitutional protection for secular, non-religious, nonprofit organizations. So if you're not a religious nonprofit organization, but you still engage in good charitable work like court-appointed special advocacy, which is a nonprofit program that I volunteered for a number of years when I was younger, they would be subject to property taxes. And so, but the ballot language of Constitutional Amendment 2 does not say that. All it says is that we are retaining the religious exemption. But in fact, they're narrowing the religious exemption and they're completely gutting the tax exemption for secular nonprofit organizations. So people really do not know what they're voting for when they look at the ballot language, and that is a major problem. Another problem with the ballot language is that it says that it will guarantee a permanent teacher pay raise in Louisiana, but that's not what the bill says. The bill does not guarantee a permanent teacher pay raise. And as William Most said, who's the attorney for people bringing suit to take Constitutional Amendment 2 off the ballot, it actually could result in a deduction of pay for teachers. It also essentially raids dedicated constitutional education trust funds. The ballot language does not say that. The ballot language does not say that the standard state tax deduction for any amount that a citizen pays in federal taxes can be deducted from their state taxes. That's in the law now. That will be removed. So there will be no constitutional protection for that deduction. It is truly bizarre that these items are not included in the ballot language and the people don't really understand and know what they're voting for. That is a big, big problem.
And Chris, just to be clear, because this amendment 2 would mean that those provisions are removed from the protection of the Constitution, does it also mean that they are automatically placed into state statute? So it is law, it's just not constitutionally protected? Or does there have to be a statute drafted and passed to move them into statute?
When something is removed from the Constitution, if there has been a law on the books already, then it would simply revert to that statute. If there's not a statute on the books, then the legislature would have to pass a law to affect it. But the fundamental problem with Constitutional Amendment 2 is that by removing these protections for religious organizations and nonprofit organizations primarily, you are leaving it in the hands of the legislature to continue that property tax exemption for those organizations. And that's what the legislature is saying. They're saying, well, it really doesn't matter here that we're taking this out of the Constitution because it's in statute. The problem with what?
Trust us?
Yeah, trust us. Exactly. Just trust us. And the point that I made in an article that I just wrote for the Hayride, we have some good conservative legislators, and I'm not knocking them, and I'm very thankful to have them. But the very legislature that is telling us to trust them on this issue of property tax exemption for religious and nonprofits, we will protect it in statute. This is the same legislature that killed a bill that would have prohibited private corporations from acquiring the use of private property against a property owner's will for this carbon capture sequestration racket, where they can take people's land and come in and bury these pipelines underground and bury this carbon dioxide against the homeowner's will. This is the same legislature that defeated legislation that would have allowed an employee that was provably injured by an experimental vaccine mandated by their employer to sue their employer for damages. This is the same legislature that created an obviously racially gerrymandered congressional district that resulted in Cleo Fields being elected to the U.S. Congress, a leftist Democrat, now threatening the thin Republican majority in the U.S. Congress. This is the same legislature that despite Representative Alan Sebaugh's efforts back during COVID in 2020, could not get enough Republican votes in the House to vacate John Bel Edwards' draconian COVID lockdown. This is a Republican-dominated legislature. So excuse me when I pause and have some reticence when the legislature says, trust us on the religious and the nonprofit, or the religious property tax exemptions and the nonprofit exemptions for secular organizations. I'm sorry, but I don't really trust that.
Yeah.
We have no way of knowing what the legislature may do in the future. And these are core constitutional protections. They belong in the Constitution, not subject to legislative whim. That's the problem.
Yeah. And I'll also say, Chris, I mean, maybe this isn't a popular thing for me to say, but it isn't just a Republican-dominated legislature. It's a governor-dominated legislature. The governor dominates the legislature.
Yes.
And
yes,
the reason we're in this
point.
position with a 115-page constitutional amendment that should not even be presented to the people in this form is because that's what the governor wanted.
That's right. And Danielle, that brings us to the broader point here. Obviously, we can't get inside the heads of legislators. We don't know what they were thinking when they passed this proposed constitutional amendment to send it to the people for a vote. We don't really know what was going on in their heads. We can presume that they were well-intended. But the bottom line is, historically and traditionally in Louisiana, the governor says jump, and the legislature says how high. The legislature's constitutional responsibility is to exercise oversight over the executive branch. The idea in Louisiana, unfortunately, of oversight over the executive branch, legislative oversight, is a fiction. The legislature in Louisiana tends to do whatever the governor tells them to do. And that's not the way our system is supposed to work. So there's a real possibility here that legislators, because of the shortened legislative session, didn't even have time to read this 115-page amendment on Constitutional Amendment 2, but we're doing it because this is what the governor wants. And now that they voted for it, to send it to the people for a vote, many of them, in all likelihood, are reluctant to come out and say, we didn't know what we were voting on. We didn't know what we were doing. This is not a good idea. And we're going to continue to have these problems, Danielle, until the legislature begins to exercise real oversight over the governor and over the executive branch. This is not a dictatorship. This is not a monarchy. This is a constitutional republic we live in. And the legislature must begin to exercise its role in a separation of powers system of oversight over the governor. And a lot of these problems will be eliminated if that happens.
Yeah, and I'm sure he could make it very uncomfortable for them for a period of time, but it's like anything else. It's a muscle that needs to be used in order to strengthen and grow. And so I think we need to see that this coming legislative session. Chris, before we move on from this, I have a couple other things I want to draw out. One is something that I've been hearing kind of rumblings of, which is, okay, there's the chance that this nonprofit religious property tax exemption could just get removed, excised from the amendment itself prior to going to ballot on March 29th, and then everything will be okay, hunky-dory with the bill. Would you just address that point?
That's not the only problem. The fact of the matter is the Constitutional Amendment 2, that would be a good start. There's no question, and it would be a real relief to churches and pastors across Louisiana. But there's other problems with Constitutional Amendment 2. It misrepresents the fact, it falsely represents that teachers will get a guaranteed permanent pay raise in Louisiana. That's not the case. All it does is continue a $2,000 stipend that they are already receiving. And there's no guarantee that it's permanent. There's no guarantee that it will be funded. And in order to do it, they are essentially deleting certain dedicated educational trust funds that serve 25 or 30,000 private and parochial students in Louisiana. So the ballot language on that does not actually represent really what will happen. The ballot language makes no mention of the fact that when you pay federal taxes, you're allowed to deduct the amount of federal taxes that you paid from your state taxes. That's being eliminated from the Constitution. That's not on the ballot. The ballot language doesn't mention that Constitutional Amendment 2 is actually divesting local authorities of their taxing authority and putting it in the hands of the state. You know, there are very significant issues here with Constitutional Amendment 2 that go beyond the religious and nonprofit exemption. So while that would be a help and a start, I don't think it salvages this amendment.
So the amendment is deceptive in the way that it's being presented, in your view?
There's absolutely no doubt about it.
Yeah. Chris, would you tell us, we had the attorney who's bringing the case against Amendment 2, William Most, on not too terribly long ago, maybe last week or a week before. Would you mention what that lawsuit is about? Maybe explain today I believe they're having their hearing, and if their case is successful, would you outline what that would mean for us going into this on March 29th?
Yeah. In a nutshell, Mr. Most is arguing that Constitutional Amendment 2, the ballot language on it, does not accurately represent what the legislation actually does. It's misleading, it's incomplete, it's biased, because it only says the purportedly good things that the amendment does, but it doesn't mention the negative parts of it that voters absolutely have a right to know. Essentially, that is his argument, is that this is structurally and substantively deficient because it does not properly apprise voters in Louisiana, the ballot language, of what they're voting on, what they're voting for, what they're voting against, and the implications of it for their lives and for the state of Louisiana. And you have to remember, Danielle, that all many voters will see before they vote is what is on that's why the ballot language is so important. How many voters do you know who are going to go even read the digest of a 115-page bill, much less read the whole bill? So that's why the ballot language is so important. And it has to be complete, it has to be accurate, it has to be simple and concise, and it has to be thorough. So people will know, no matter how you vote, whether you vote for or against, a core requirement in a democratic government is that people know what they are voting for. And this ballot language fails that test. And that's why it's so important going forward that we get this right. Because if this is allowed to stand, if the legislature can, with legal impunity, represent things on the ballot language that do not accurately reflect what the proposed amendment actually does, that's a very dangerous precedent. And it really thwarts the democratic process because it diminishes transparency and voters don't know what they're going to the polls to vote on. It's extremely important that we get this right.
So if William Most is successful today in his suit against Secretary of State Landry, what happens?
One of two things will happen. If I don't know exactly where the Secretary of State is in the process of getting these ballots out, I don't know where that process is. One of two things will happen. Either this will not go on the ballot at all if he wins, because the court will have ruled that it's illegal, it's unconstitutional, it violates Louisiana law, this ballot language, so it can't go on the ballot. Or if they are in a process beyond which they really can't go back and reverse it, getting it on a ballot, then the Secretary of State would instruct that this is on the ballot because we're in a stage in the process where we can't avoid having it on the ballot. but you don't have to vote on it. You shouldn't vote on it. But if you do, it will have no effect. It will have no legal effect. So whatever happens, if Mr. Mose and these plaintiffs, these two pastors and these two teachers are successful, then Constitutional Amendment 2 is dead on arrival. It will never become law in Louisiana.
Well, I pray that's the case, Chris. I absolutely pray that's the case. This is the reason that I believe it's so important that we have single issue bills, single issue propositions. And, the legislature, I think it's a disgrace that the legislature would pass something like this on to the people where we have to pick and choose, say, okay, well, what's more important to me? And just looking at the face of it, you're saying, well, do I want permanent teacher pay raise, or is that more important to me than the property tax exemption status for nonprofits? And even that is not a fair question, because that's not what's actually in the amendment. So this whole thing is a huge mess. And I would just encourage people, if you are listening to this, send it to your pastor. Make sure that your pastor is aware of this issue, because they need to be talking about this, just like our recent guest, the railroad commissioner for Texas, Wayne Christian, at the end of last week told us only 6% of pastors are speaking from the pulpit about issues that are impacting the day-to-day lives of their parishioners, because they're cultural issues, they're political issues, they're governmental issues. They absolutely need to be speaking about this, and they need to be informed about this. And so please, by all means, do send this episode on to your pastors so they can be aware of the issues that we're facing at the ballot box on March 29th, and truly sooner than that with early voting. Chris, do you happen to know when early voting starts? I did not look it up.
March 15th.
Okay, well, that's
early voting.
Yeah, okay, 3 days from now.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. I think I can let us move on, Chris, from Amendment 2. Do you want to jog back to Amendment 1 since we skipped over that one?
Sure. Amendment 1, one of the justifications, by the way, Danielle, that the governor and the legislature are giving in removing property tax exemptions for religious and nonprofits from the Constitution, or at least narrowing the ones for religious, entirely removing secular nonprofit tax exemption, is that they want to, quote, declutter the Constitution. Well, if they're trying to declutter the Constitution, why are they retaining Constitutional Amendment 1? Why is that even in existence? Constitutional Amendment 1.
It's a funny place to start, huh?
Yeah, that is also on the March 29th ballot. And that has to do with circumstances in which the Louisiana Supreme Court, or giving the Louisiana Supreme Court authority to discipline out-of-state lawyers who are in Louisiana practicing on a limited basis, or just for one case, they commit misconduct. This amendment gives the Louisiana Supreme Court authority to discipline and sanction those lawyers, which they currently don't have. Well, I believe that the Louisiana Supreme Court should be able to discipline any lawyer who's practicing in this state, whether they're practicing on one case or here for 10 cases. But they're out-of-state lawyers. Louisiana Supreme Court should be able to discipline them. But it doesn't belong in the Constitution. This is something that belongs in statute. This is something that the legislature has prerogative to handle and should be handling. Issues related to lawyer discipline does not belong in the Louisiana Constitution. This amendment is a textbook example, Danielle, of why the Louisiana Constitution is 26,000 words long and has been amended 217 times since 1974 because of items like this. So if they're saying they want to declutter the Constitution, why don't we start there with Constitutional Amendment 1? It sort of makes their argument disingenuous. So in order to declutter the Constitution, they're narrowing a core protection for religious organizations on their property taxes, tax exemption, and they're gutting entirely, taking out of the Constitution, the property tax exemption for secular nonprofits, but they're keeping in the Constitution what is clearly a policy issue involving lawyer discipline and lawyer sanctions. It doesn't make any sense. And that's the reason why we're opposing Amendment 1 as well. Not because we don't believe the Louisiana Supreme Court should be able to discipline lawyers, but because it doesn't belong in the governing document of our state. The Constitution is a governing document. It's not an instrument of policymaking.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's really well said, Chris. And I recall that whenever we were moving into early 2024, there was an interest by the governor and some legislators in having a constitutional convention to declutter the Constitution. And that, of course, did not come to fruition. But I also recall at the end of the last session, I think it was the end of the regular session, we were looking at a number of constitutional amendments, and there were quite a lot of them that were being put forward. And the word then was that the governor really didn't want any constitutional amendments for that reason of decluttering. And so here we are. A few of them made it through. Of course, we expected a couple of them to make it through, but I couldn't agree with you more. This doesn't belong in the Constitution. In fact, this is probably the exact kind of policy that makes Louisiana makes the people of Louisiana believe, and I think rightfully so, that we need tort reform. Because why should our Constitution have governance or be able to explain how attorneys are treated, or do their day-to-day job? This is not the appropriate place for this kind of legislation. It's really not. It's in statute.
Yeah, it does.
And Chris, I'm struggling because your picture is frozen on this side, so I can't tell whenever you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I can't tell when you're done talking, but yeah, we're just going to walk through it.
We can walk through it.
But,
let me make one more point about this, Danielle.
Yeah.
Let me make one more point about this. The United States, and I want to make a contrast between the United States Constitution and the Louisiana Constitution. The United States Constitution has been amended.
The United States Constitution, Danielle, has been amended 17 times if you exclude the Bill of Rights. 17 times since 1791. It's 4 large pages long. Our founding fathers, and fortunately, our Congress and Senate, regardless of differences we may have with many of them on policy issues, they understand the difference between fundamental constitutional principles and privileges and policymaking. As I said a minute ago, the Louisiana Constitution is 26,000 words long, has been amended 217 times. We have to get back to understanding the distinction between those two things, between policymaking and fundamental constitutional privileges and rights. And if we do that,
and on that point,
yeah.
Sorry, on that point, Chris, the reason that the Louisiana state constitution is 217 pages long, is that what you said? No, it's been amended. It's over 26,000 words, you said.
Words.
It's pretty thick. And the reason, we've discussed this before, the reason it's that long is because the people of the state of Louisiana have had many, many reasons to mistrust our leaders. We've had many reasons to mistrust the officials in this government. We've had many reasons to mistrust the fact that they were elected in the first place. Our elections have been rife with corruption. We were the joke along with Illinois for decades before the election questions that we're facing today. So we can't just pretend that that wasn't the case. A lot of these things are codified in our Constitution because we don't trust the government. And I think that's a reasonable position to be in. So if the government wants us to trust them, they need to start putting things in statute that we can trust, and they need to start making sure that they follow the law themselves.
Yeah, very true. That's an excellent point. Excellent point. Yeah, I don't think that
in truth, probably, sorry, Chris, Amendment 2 probably should not be, some of the things that they're proposing to take out of the Constitution probably should be allowed to be taken out of the Constitution, but we're not at a level of trust where we're saying, we believe that you're operating in good faith and taking this out of the Constitution Because look what they're doing with Amendment 1. Why should we trust what they're doing with Amendment 2 if we can see with our own eyes what they're trying to do with Amendment 1?
Yes. And to jump around here for a second, Danielle, Amendment 4, getting back to decluttering the Constitution, Amendment 4, that's also on the March 29th ballot, that has to do with judicial elections and when you can fill a judicial vacancy with a new election. Okay? Is that something that belongs in the Louisiana Constitution? No. That is a policy issue that should be passed in statute by the legislature. The timing of judicial elections and when a vacancy can be filled is a matter for the legislature, not a matter for the Constitution. So there's 4 amendments on the ballot. 50% of them, half of them, involve issues that don't even belong in the Constitution. So don't talk to me about decluttering the Constitution, and that's why we need to narrow the religious exemption, and we need to gut the secular tax exemption for nonprofits. If you're going to keep these other 2 items in the Constitution, it makes no sense.
And there's an argument to be made that none of this belongs in a true Constitution, in a clean, simple, straightforward Constitution, which ours is not.
Yeah. Well, to be honest with you, if you know, you're right, Danielle. Maybe we wouldn't need a specific provision in the Constitution that says religious organizations do not have to pay money to the government in order to be able to operate. Maybe we wouldn't need that if we simply honored the more fundamental principle in the Constitution of religious freedom and the separation of church and state. Yeah, you're right. Maybe we wouldn't need it in there. But I do believe the level of mistrust that exists on the part of the broad base of citizens in Louisiana of their government has motivated some of these provisions that are in the Constitution.
And that's why we're here. That's why we are where we are. I just think the way that this legislature and governor operates moving forward will be a good indication for citizens on whether we can trust them, on whether we should trust them, or if we need to have every single right of ours enshrined in the Constitution. You know, Chris, the rights that were enshrined in the Constitution to protect us from what happened during COVID were not honored. So, like I said, if they started honoring the law, if they started respecting and following the existing law, then maybe we would feel more comfortable with them wanting to pass new laws.
Yes, but time and time again, ordinary, everyday Louisiana citizens, Danielle, get deceived by their leaders. And as I said a few minutes ago, in the state of Louisiana, our legislature failed to protect private property owners from having these big carbon capture sequestration projects on their land against their will. This is an assault on a core private property right. This is something that our founding fathers shed their blood for. Private property is a sacred right under our Constitution. Our legislature had an opportunity to prohibit what is current law in Louisiana, these big carbon capture companies from acquiring the use of their property for these projects. And they failed to do it. If the citizens don't fully trust their government in this state right now, they have very valid reasons for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm not going to take the government's word that the government is going to protect religious organizations from having when, they have failed us in a number of other areas.
Yeah, exactly. This is like your teenager taking your car without telling you. And look, why should I trust you again? Why should I trust you right now? You're going to have to prove yourself. There's a proving period. And then when I believe that I can trust you, you can ask me kindly, politely for the car, and then maybe I will give it to you, maybe I won't. That's what we're dealing with right now in the state of Louisiana. And Chris, did I just lose my thought? Did it fly away? I also wanted to mention another bill that the legislature couldn't pass this year, which I thought was a shame. And that was a privacy bill that said that would have told car manufacturers and insurers that they can't just take the data from your car and make decisions based on that. They can't judge your insurance rates based on that. The legislature did not pass that. So we are still subject to an invasion of privacy in our own vehicles because our legislature, those that we sent to Baton Rouge to represent us, did not stand up for a bill that would have said, you know what, insurance companies, it's not really your business. If they get into an accident, don't call them, they'll call you.
Then it becomes their business. But what you're saying here, Danielle, is there was a bill that would have prohibited, let's say you're driving in your car and maybe you exceed the speed limit by 10 miles an hour. No accident. Nothing happens, okay? There's no accident. Right now, insurance company can get that data and use
from your dealership and use that data to raise your insurance rates when you've done nothing wrong. That is a serious invasion of privacy. This legislation would have prohibited that, and our legislature didn't get it passed. So, and the insurance company never has to tell you that they got your data, right? They just tell you that your rates went up.
Exactly.
That's how it happens.
They never even have to disclose it. So, excuse me if my trust and the trust of many citizens across Louisiana is not very high right now in our government.
Exactly. Chris, why don't you get into Amendment 3 now?
Yeah. Amendment 3 is really, really important. Danielle, this is an amendment that would, well, let me start from the beginning here. Right now in the Constitution, there are certain 17 or 18 specifically enumerated crimes, very serious crimes, for which a minor can be prosecuted as an adult, depending upon the circumstances of the crime and the minor's background, minor's criminal history, whatever. It's a decision that district attorneys in conjunction with judges make on a case-by-case basis, okay? This amendment would allow the legislature to determine and probably make this decision that all minors, when they're charged with any felony, whether it's a nonviolent felony, felony theft, that sort of thing, must be prosecuted as adults and thrown into the criminal justice system and potentially incarcerated with adult hardened criminals. Now, nobody's more conservative than I am. Nobody believes in law and order more than me. But this is not a decision that the legislature is in any position to make. This is a decision that has to be made when you're dealing with minors on a case-by-case basis, based upon what's in the best interest of society and the circumstances of the case, background of the minor, as I said. For the legislature to come in here and try to usurp what is really an executive responsibility and impose by legislative fiat a rule that every minor in every felony case has to be prosecuted as an adult is insane, absolutely insane. If you don't like your DA or you don't like a judge because you don't think they're handling cases properly, the solution is to get together and vote them out of office. The solution is not for the legislature to come in and impose a uniform rule, not when you're dealing with minors especially. It is way too important, and I think this is insane. And don't let anybody tell you, well, the legislature is not going to impose this uniform rule. We're not going to say that all minors have to be prosecuted as adults in all felony cases. We're just going to come up with a certain list. Well, there's already a list. There's 17 or 18 crimes in the Constitution. And I'm telling you, because I was in committee when the author, the proponent of this bill, testified in committee, I was sitting right next to her, the Senator Heather Cloud. There's no question that the ultimate goal of the legislature is to mandate that all minors be prosecuted as adults in all felony cases. And there's no way, as a constitutional conservative and as someone who has a sense of what is wise and what is not wise in cases like this. There's no way we can go along with this. I'm not saying that there aren't bad judges and that there aren't bad DAs, and maybe there are cases where minors should be prosecuted as adults when they're not, but the solution is not legislative fiat. The solution is not for the legislative branch to impose its will on the executive and say, here's what you're going to do. It's not their constitutional role to do that. And I think amendment, and on a practical level, Danielle, as I think you mentioned to me before the show started, this will do nothing. This grew out, Danielle. You remember the big rush in the criminal session in 2024, where everybody was in there and we're tough on crime and we're going to beat our chest and we're going to come out of this being able to say, you know what, we passed all these laws and we're going to make it to where minors are going to be prosecuted as adults in these criminal cases. And we're just going to, it was a beat my chest session. And you and I, in looking at the bills and looking at the Constitution, opposed a number of those bills precisely because A, we thought they were unwise, and B, we knew that they would do nothing to reduce crime in Louisiana. And this amendment, if it passes, will do nothing to reduce crime in Louisiana. If anything, because more and more minors will be rubbing shoulders with adult hardened criminals in a criminal justice system, guess what they're going to do? They're just going to become better criminals. That's what's going to happen. They're just going to become better criminals. I promise you, this will do nothing to reduce crime in Louisiana. I have a huge problem with Amendment 3.
Well, Chris, I agree with you. And you and I spent a lot of time kind of, I wouldn't say debating this, but just talking through how these issues, the Republican-led legislature was so wrong on so many of these issues when it relates to the way to handle criminal justice. First of all, do we want to put these minors in a position? I mean, they will be very unsafe in a max security prison with adults. That's unsafe, period. We're talking about full-grown men, full-grown women. That's not a safe place for these kids. It's not a way for them to get rehabilitated. One of the big disappointments out of this criminal session for both, I know you agreed with me on this, Chris, there was no talk of how do we rehabilitate these criminals? How do we encourage more prison ministry? How do we, if we're going to go so hard on crime, where do we put all these people? We don't have the beds in prison in Louisiana to put minors on top of more criminals, for all these maxed out sentences they wanted and pushed, and some of them they achieved. So this to me is so upsetting, and it's even more upsetting in the light of some of the political prosecutions we've seen.
Prosecutions.
No, the political prosecutions we've seen. Because I think about someone like Tina Peters, who is, I just heard on day 9 of COVID in a jail for political persecution reasons because she was on the wrong side of the opposing side. She's on the right side of the issue with the election systems. And she is in a very, very horrible place. The prisons in America and the jails in America, and I would venture to say in Louisiana, are not places where people can live in good health. They're not places where people feel humanely treated. And so here we are. Those are the kinds of conditions that people like Tina Peters, people like Jeremy Harrell, who have literally come under the thumb of tyranny in the state of Colorado, tyranny at the Department of Justice and the FBI. Jeremy Harrell is in a prison where it's raining. They don't have a good roof. So they're all in there exposed to black mold. Tina Peters has a restricted diet because of her cancer. And she is subsisting on carrots and peanut butter sandwiches, right?
What a travesty.
This is not the way to treat people, regardless of why they're in prison. We're supposed to be a society that treats people humanely. If these are Christian conservatives, I know Heather Cloud is a believer. Why is she pushing for these children to be put in a position where they can be abused and terrorized by large people, like by full-grown adults? It makes no sense to me. I want to see this legislature address recidivism. I want to see this legislature look at criminal justice reform through the lens of actually bringing people out of here and letting them be in a position to be productive members of society by prosecuting, by constitutionally codifying that every single minor that commits a felony goes to prison with adults. That is not accomplishing the end that we want to see in the state of Louisiana. And Chris, you and I have talked about this so many times. The real core issue here is missing fathers. The core issue is not that they are not getting punished hard enough, right? And I do believe in punishment. I am a justice-driven human being. If there's something at the core of my being, it is justice. And I expect to see justice from the Trump administration. I want to see justice from our law enforcement in the state of Louisiana. But the way to deal with this is not by putting minors in adult prison.
Yeah, except in rare circumstances that are already provided for in the Constitution. You're 100% right. And Danielle, when you talked about rehabilitation and recidivism, specifically rehabilitation, I don't think that there was ever a discussion in the criminal legislative session in 2024. I never heard anybody talk about, except the people who were opposing some of this legislation, to talk about rehabilitation. I am sorry, but I am not a jaded human being. And when a 15-year-old commits a crime because he doesn't have a father and he's from a broken home, even a serious crime, that doesn't mean that it is wise or that we have the right to throw him into an adult criminal justice system. I believe that at that age, even the U.S. Supreme Court has said that minors are not fully developed. And in the Miller case, U.S. Supreme Court said that there's a presumption that minors have the capacity to be rehabilitated. We should operate from that presumption instead of from the opposite presumption that just because they've committed a crime, and even a serious crime, we're going to prosecute them as adults and stick them in an adult prison. That is simply not the way Christians are supposed to approach this, and it's not the way a humane society should approach this.
I agree. Now, Chris, before we came on air today, you mentioned that there was a lawsuit regarding constitutional amendments 1 and 3. Would you maybe walk through what you know about that?
I just read this morning that there was a lawsuit filed to try to nullify Amendment 1, deals with, again, lawyer discipline, and then 4, which deals with filling judicial, 1 and 4, dealing with judicial vacancies in elections. I don't know what the nature of the suit was. I hope that one of the grounds is that these are not constitutional issues. These are issues that belong in the legislature, and they're not properly the subjects of constitutional consideration, because they're not. And so we'll see what happens with those. I believe that it was filed in Baton Rouge, but I will. I'm going to read up on that today and see what it's about. But we do know this: we know that there's a lawsuit to try to nullify Constitutional Amendment 2, which we've already discussed. And now we found out there's another lawsuit to try to keep Amendments 1 and 4 off the ballot. And so we're going to continue to watch. And I can't help but think, Danielle, that, there may be some buyer's remorse right now among some of these legislators. And I believe, there's no way I can prove this, but what I believe happened is this. The reason why 2/3 of the legislature, Republicans, almost all the Republicans, voted to put these amendments on the statewide ballot, 2 reasons. The first reason is that they probably didn't have time to read the bills because it was a shortened session, very protracted, and particularly in reference to Constitutional Amendment 2, it's 115 pages. I'm sure that they didn't have time to read it. I'm sure that many of them really didn't know what they were voting for. Yeah. The second reason why I believe they did this and why they're continuing to push this is because, as we talked about it earlier, the political structure of our government in Louisiana is such that the governor has an enormous amount of power. And if legislators do not do his bidding and do what he wants, then there is severe reprisal to them. And so they're reluctant to go against him for that reason. And I don't believe they're fully informed about what they voted on. That's why we're dealing with this right now. So
It is.
The secret to losing weight 2 times faster has gone viral. See the transformations hundreds of thousands of people are experiencing around the world with the Slender Eyes drops. These homeopathic drops are proven to control appetite, support thyroid function, help balance the body's pH, improve energy, boost mood, and increase metabolic rate. I've heard firsthand testimonials from droppers in their 20s to droppers in their 80s who say that the Slender Eyes drops have completely revolutionized their lives. Try the drops today to see the results for yourself. To learn more about the Slender Eyes drops or other incredible natural wellness and lifestyle products, email me at info@freedomstate.us and put drops in the subject line, or visit the Shop Our Partners page at freedomstate.us. We also have links to those in the show notes. Thank you for supporting the state of freedom.
And I'll just continue my drumbeat of, we need to get to a place where we are only bringing forward, the legislature is only bringing forward single issue bills, because the legislators don't have time to read the bills. And look what they passed on to the people. This is especially Amendment 2 in terms of the volume of things that are in that bill or that are in that proposed amendment is just, it's not acceptable. And so
and let me mention this. Let me mention this, Danielle, because you've mentioned a couple of times now the single object or single subject.
Yes.
Okay, if you're not amending an entire article, which they're not amending in CA2, they're not amending all of Article 7, right? They are amending only parts of it. So if you're only amending a part of an article, there can only be one object that is the subject of the amendment. They have so many different issues that are brought up in this amendment, that it violates the state law on those grounds alone. And so I think you're right. We have to get back to a point where voters are going in, if they're going to vote on an amendment, there's one issue that they're voting on. It's simple, it's concise, it's clear, it's complete, it's unbiased, and it's objective. Now I understand the temptation, Danielle, if you're a legislator and you're authoring proposed constitutional amendment, the natural inclination is to put on the ballot the language that you think is mostly likely to result in a favorable vote. Okay, I understand that. But it's so important that it be accurate, that it be objective, and that they resist the urge to only put things on the ballot language that are favorable and exclude the things that may make a voter look at it and say, no, I can't vote for that. We can't do that. Because I said earlier, it really impedes representation of the citizens in the political process in a meaningful way.
Yeah. And Chris, one thing that's come up as we've been talking is that the citizens of the state of Louisiana, including the legislators, including the governor, including the law enforcement body, including the judicial branch, needs to really take a long, hard look at the separation of powers, examine it and say, am I doing what is in the bounds of my job? The governor doesn't need to be doing the job of the legislature. The legislature doesn't need to be doing the job of the judges. Everyone needs to just focus on what their actual job is. And if they're strafing outside of those lines, the people need to swat it down and say no.
Yeah, no question about it. We talked earlier on Amendment 3 here in dealing with criminal prosecutions of minors. The legislature is clearly strafing outside the scope of its constitutional authority. No doubt about it. And when I said earlier, Danielle, if I said 4, Amendment 3 is the subject of the new suit. 1 and 3, the one that where the legislature is trying to usurp power to ensure that all minors are prosecuted as adults in the case of felonies. And the argument in the suit is that it's unconstitutional because it violates the separation of powers. It invades the province of the executive branch, and it really does.
It really does. And so if we haven't been crystal clear in all of our discussion today, we are recommending that we oppose and vote no for all 4 amendments.
Yes, for all
right?
4 amendments for a variety of different reasons. Always also wanted to mention, Danielle, that there's a Hayride article that should be coming out today that really lays out my position on Constitutional Amendment 2. And I would encourage people to read that. We'll post it up so that people have an opportunity to look at that. This is really important. To reemphasize one final time here, Danielle, we have to make sure that we stand up and against the idea that on ballot language that people are going to go in and read in order to decide how they vote, that language must accurately represent the good, the bad, and the ugly of the proposed amendment. It has to be short, concise, clear, complete, unbiased, and thorough. And if it is that, regardless of how a voter votes, they will at least know what they're voting on. And the ballot language on Constitutional Amendment 2 just fails that very important test. And we can't allow this precedent to be set. So if the lawsuit does not successfully take this off the ballot, and it's allowed to go onto the ballot, then the citizens of Louisiana have to stand up and say no on March 20th.
Yeah. And I will be doing that, Chris. I will be saying no, 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 and no.
4 times.
Awesome. Well, Chris, I think we had a lot of fun today on a audible call of let's get through the amendments.
I always have fun with you.
So thank you for walking us through those. I really appreciate it. And for anyone who wants more information or just would like to read about it, Chris mentioned he's got his article coming out in the Hayride. Chris, are you also putting out information on LACAG.org about these 4 amendments?
Yeah, and I'm doing, and also I want people to go to our LACAG Facebook page as well, because we have a number of posts that deal very directly with these amendments, and also on LACAG X page, because we cover it very, very broadly on both of those social media venues.
Great. And
yeah.
Maybe I'll just mention, if you are a person who's listening to this, you're a person who's following politics in this state, you're a person who's following politics more broadly, please send, even if it's just a write-up, even if it's just a Facebook post, to your friends how they should vote, because they're not following it, and they're probably the people that call you and say, hey, how are you voting on these amendments? I don't know what to do, but I'm planning to vote. Be sure that you're the proactive one that says, hey, this is a crap show, and we need to swat these down.
Yeah. And I couldn't agree more, because the turnout is going to be probably very low, Danielle. So it is so important that you get the word out and let people know how important it is to vote no on these amendments, because we've got to return our government to the people. And this will be a good start.
Yeah, it will. And Chris, I'll go ahead. You send me the Facebook post and the X post, and we'll put those as well as the LACAG page all in the show notes. So you'll be able to grab those easily and share them with friends and family. And you can remind them on the 29th that it's time to get out and vote.
Let's do this thing, Danielle.
All right. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. We'll talk soon.
Thanks for joining us today on the State of Freedom. Be sure and check out the show notes for this episode. You can always go there and find the calls to action and resources mentioned in the show, and you can find out more information about our advertisers there as well. If you want to learn more about us or support our work, visit freedomstate.us. To get involved with Louisiana Citizen Advocacy Group, visit lacag.org. We'll see you next time. God bless.